Good morning. A couple of days ago, Steve and I had a conversation through email, and one of the questions was, do I need an introduction or not? And it's like, I've already been a member of this church for a year, along with my wife Linda. And then we started talking and saying, okay, but 3 months the church was closed or whatever, and all I can tell is people from here up. So anyway, just for those who don't know who I am, my name is Carlton Hafer. As I said, Linda and I joined here about a year ago. We were looking for a teaching church, and it's been wonderful to be here. In the past, I have received a Master of Divinity and Master of Theology degrees from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary, and I'm a little over halfway done now with a PhD in Bible exposition. I was also an adjunct professor at Washington Bible College and Lancaster Bible College, and in addition to that, spent 4 years as the teaching elder at a Grace Brethren Church. And with Kevin out of town, he asked if I could fill in today in the pulpit. So I am looking forward to this. Actually, let me see what else. Okay. All right. Before we get started, I'd like you to take a brief look at this photograph, and I'll leave it up here for a few minutes. You'll understand why. We'll come back to it in a little bit. Now, one of the things we're going to do today's message is going to be taught entirely on context. Now, when I say context, there's a number of different contexts. The verses around it, the chapter, there's the historical context, there's the audience, there's all kinds of contexts. But most misinterpretations you're going to find, or an awful lot of them in the Bible today, are due to people not paying attention to context. So even though we're going to go through several sets of verses, in addition to that, think of it in this way: how can I apply this to studying the Bible and learning about the Bible? Because this isn't just to learn about a few verses and see how they play out in context. It's so that we can use this to study and to learn more about the Bible. Now, many, many years ago, I was in a church, and at this church, every Sunday night, the college and career class would get together. And we'd go to a different parent's house every week, and we'd have a little party and, spend an hour or two. It was a great fellowship, great way to get to know each other. But something happened at one of these parties that I will never forget. Because there was a tall girl standing in the kitchen getting her food at the party. And everything's going fine. She's standing there. And while she's standing there, all of a sudden, a guy who was maybe 15 feet away goes running across the room and smacking her in the head over and over. He must have hit her 10 or 15 times in 3 or 4 seconds. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I got to tell you something here. I was the guy that ran across the room and started hitting her in the head. But there's a reason for it, because I knew one tiny little fact that nobody else knew. She didn't even know it. Her head was on fire. Now, I don't mean it was a little tongue of Pentecost, 2-inch, little flame of Pentecost type thing. I mean it was on fire. Her entire top of her, she had one of these, 1970s hairdos, if you know what I'm saying, out to about here. Very pretty, but it was just, you use about 4 gallons of hairspray to hold the thing in place and everything. And there was a candle on the table. When she bent over like this, people don't realize, you may have a flame like this, but you may have an invisible flame like this. It caught the top of it. Literally, her entire head was at least a foot tall in flames. Now, I said to myself, 2 things. I actually thought I was going to burn my hands putting it out. I didn't, because all I had was my hands, so I was beating it out. I was shocked I didn't get hurt. But the other thing that happened was I said to myself, I can either run over here and do this, or I could walk over and I say, excuse me, but do you realize that your head is on fire? Perhaps I could be of assistance. By the time I said that, those extra 3 seconds would have been the end of her head. As it turned out, by running across the room and immediately hitting her in the head over and over again, she had no injuries. And it was, at least not from the fire. Tried not to hit her too hard. But the point is, she had no injuries. And it was because of action taken, because I knew something that nobody else in the room had spotted. That's called context. It's in life, it's context. We have the same thing in the Bible. We're going to see verses in the Bible. We're going to say, you know something? This verse, we thought it meant something, but when we look at it and what it's really saying in context, it does not mean what we thought it said. All right. Okay. And you know what I learned? There's a trick I learned here. Turn it on. Okay. Forgot to turn it on. We're going to turn first off to Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. One thing that I have learned over and over and over again is, I don't care who you talk to, there are 2 verses that every non-Christian knows, because they're going to throw them in your face. One of them, they're going to quote, God is love. We're not going to talk about that today, but believe it or not, that has a whole different meaning and context too. But the other one that you're going to hear over and over again is, judge not, lest ye be judged. You've probably all heard it, and usually the people telling you that are people who, couldn't find another verse in the Bible if their life depended on it. Want to look at these verses specifically and say, what is the context of these verses? Does it really say, do not judge? Because one of the problems we've got is, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, what 1 Corinthians chapter 5 said? Why are you not judging? What's going on here? Because Paul's saying you should be judging, and Jesus was saying, don't judge. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is where this verse comes from. This verse is part of the Sermon on the Mount. I've said for many, many years that the two most dangerous places in the entire Bible to take doctrine are the book of Proverbs and the Sermon on the Mount. The reason is because in the book of Proverbs, people think that every one of those is a promise. No, it's a wisdom saying that is generally true. It was never intended to be that. But the reason the Sermon on the Mount is dangerous is because all of the teachings that Jesus taught in these 3 chapters happened over probably 2 to 3 days. And what we have is the Sermon on the Mount is the headline summary, almost like the old CNN headline news type thing. And that's all you're getting in these. You're not getting details of what's going on, and you're not seeing the audience either. So the point is, sometimes things will be said. For example, Christ talked about divorce. If you compare what Christ said about divorce in the Sermon on the Mount and compare that to what Paul said, they look different. They're not different because what you got is the headline summary by Christ and then more exposition by Paul. In this case, however, one of the things we're going to see is we look at Matthew 7:1 said, do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and your standard of measure will be measured to you. The first thing we're missing, if we go on, when we get to verse 5, it says, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. When Jesus Christ said these things, he was talking to an extremely legalistic group composed of Pharisees and a number of others, primarily the Pharisees and scribes who are very legalistic, and he was telling them, guys, you pretend to be the ultimate Christian leaders here, not Christian, actually Jewish leaders here, sorry. And if you look, he said things to the Pharisees and other places like, you are whited sepulchres. You ever think about what that means? A sepulcher was a rotting tomb of death. So basically, you are rotting death, and somebody took white paint and put it all over it, and then everything's cool because you got white paint. That is an insult beyond insults. Well, that's what Christ was saying to them. This was his audience as well. And when he's talking to people like that and saying this about judge not lest ye be judged, what you got to realize is he's talking to people that were extremely judgmental and trying to puff themselves up as, hi, I'm the ultimate Jewish authority, the ultimate Jewish religious authority. So to start with, that's part of the context. So what he's saying is remove the log first so you can see clearly. So he's not saying don't judge. He's saying you need to get the sin out of your own life before you start condemning everybody else. In addition to that, the other thing I want to say about this is most people that quote that verse don't want to talk about Matthew 6:30-34, which is a passage right before that. Anybody know what that is? We're going to read it here. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly think all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Now, if you look at verse 34, does anybody in here ever have a checking account, or a savings account, or an investment account? How come? It says right there, don't worry about tomorrow. What are you doing? What do you worry about tomorrow for? It's taking it out of context. This is the verse immediately before, judge not lest you be judged. If we treat that verse here the same way as the next verse, we get horribly out of context things that are being said. In each case, the people understood. When he said, don't take any care for tomorrow, he's not saying, don't put food away, don't store your food up or things like that. What he was saying to them is, don't focus so much on your earthly things that you miss out what's happening on the heavenly things here. So again, the context is critical for us to understand what's going on. I want to go next to Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28 is a verse that I bet almost everybody in this place could quote with their eyes closed. Well, I guess, when you're quoting something, I guess it doesn't really matter if you have your eyes open or closed. But I bet virtually everyone could quote that verse, and we know that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. And not only that, every time somebody gets sick or every time somebody gets to the hospital, I've been through this, so I know it's true. You know, people show up one after another, and everybody quotes Romans 8:28. You broke your arm. Sorry you broke your arm, but God's going to make something better out of this than you ever expected. Maybe somebody will get saved. You see what I'm saying? That's the whole thought behind it. The problem is that kind of gets into prosperity gospel. But what I want to talk to you about is, not only is that not the meaning of this when we look at the chapter context, but in addition to that, the real promise that we miss is far better than anything we tell people about. Far better. We start looking at the chapter. I want to start in verse 11 and just read a few verses to you. I want you to listen for the words glorification, resurrected body, mortal body, anything related to glorification. Okay? Glorification, by the way, is your final resurrection from the dead and being transformed into a glorified body. Verse 11, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. Okay, so he's talking about raising our mortal bodies. Good. Verse 17, so that we may also be glorified with him. Oh, glorification again. Resurrection of the body, receiving a glorified body. We go to verse 18. For I consider that the present sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us. Glorification again. Verse 19. The revealing to the anxious longing of creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. The revealing of the sons of God is the resurrection and the final glorification. So far we're saying over and over and over, this is about glorification. Verse 21, and that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. End times again. So what Paul's talking about over and over and over in these verses so far is glorification in the end times. In verse 23, having the first fruits of the Spirit, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. The redemption of our body happens at the end times. The point being is, so far we've got an entire chapter that's talking about glorification over and over and over again. And yet we get to verse 28 and all of a sudden we say, no, we got another subject here. Well, one of the things we can also see is, if you take verse 28 as meaning temporal things that happen on the earth, for God's going to work all things together for good. Then you get to verse 29 and 30 where all of a sudden Paul is talking about predestination. And not only that, look at the summary, the last words of verse 30. The whole purpose here, he predestined, he also called, these will be called, he also justified, those whom he justified, he also glorified. The entire summary in verse 30 is going back to glorification. So what we've got is either in verse 29 and 30, Paul decided, let's just go to a brand new topic that we haven't thought of and talk about predestination. Or Paul's saying, you know, I've been talking about glorification the entire time. Let's finish it up and wrap it up here and talk about how your glorification was predestined. The reason I bring that up is there is no promise that if something in this verse, that if something happens bad, it's going to be turned into something good. But there is an absolute promise that if you are a believer, no matter how bad it gets, even if it means your death, you will have a glorified body. Man, that's a better promise than anything we could get on this earth. And not just that, but I'm not saying God doesn't have a plan for us. There's other verses in the New Testament we can find. God does have a plan for us. But the point being is, that's not what Romans 8:28 is talking about. That's why we have to be careful about context. And one of the problems we have is, you might say, well, why does it matter if we get the wrong context? Isn't God going to use things for good anyway? Because every time we learn a verse wrong, or learn a doctrine wrong, we're liable to take that doctrine and apply it to another doctrine, and that becomes wrong, and over until you've built this house of cards. I've seen it many times. Let's go ahead and turn to Romans 13, 1 through 7. I don't know if we're going to get through all of these verses today or not. We'll get through as many as we can. This is a verse that today we have to pay more attention to than any other time in certainly the last 50 years, maybe in our history. This is the verse that is talking about how we must obey the civil authorities that are over us. And you know something? When you've got a pastor like John MacArthur sitting out in California saying, no, we need to show up in the churches, we need to open the church anyways, how do those two match each other? Is John MacArthur, has he lost his mind? Or is he actually seeing something that the Bible teaches? Well, you know what happens here in this verse? What we have to look at here is the historical context of the verse. Because if we don't know when this verse was written and why it was written and what was going on around it, we can't possibly interpret this. One of the things you probably know is that when Paul wrote Romans, Nero was the emperor. Nero ruled from 54 AD to 68 AD. Nero was not a good guy, okay? Nero was I think if I remember correctly, he was the nephew of Caligula, another nice guy. And it was pretty much a battle of which one of those two in Roman history was the worst of all the emperors. These guys were absolute sick morons, okay? But the point is that what people don't realize is Romans was written in 57 or 58 AD. Nero ruled from 54 to 68. But you know something? Nero was a completely different ruler from 54 to 60 AD. When the book of Romans was written, Nero was listening to his two advisors, Seneca and Burrus. And not only that, his mother was also helping him to govern, because Nero took office. Nero was like 14, 15, 16 years old when he became emperor. Now, the mother kind of stepped out of the picture in 59 AD when he had her murdered. That will usually slow you down as far as giving advice to your son. Yeah, that's the kind of guy Nero was. Seneca and Burrus in 60 AD stepped down. I think Burrus was the head of the Praetorian Guard, if I remember, and Seneca was his tutor. The point being is that all of a sudden the restraints were taken away. And nobody knows if Nero went nuts or if these restraints being taken away were what happened. But in 60 AD approximately, Nero completely changed. From 54 to 60, you know what it was called by many people? The Golden Age of Rome. Because bad governors were being removed if they were taking advantage of the people. They wouldn't allow that. They were looking for the people. They were building the things. They weren't spending lavishly either like they had been beforehand. 60 AD, everything changed. Now, there's a reason I've got this picture up here. I don't know if I took it or my wife Linda took it. We took literally thousands and thousands of photos. One of our trips we did was over to Rome. This is overlooking Nero's gardens, okay? And I'll tell you something, I had kind of a little bit of shuddering to stand, and it's part of his garden, it's a large complex. Shuddering to stand there, because you know what Nero used to do after 60 AD? Nero would have garden parties that anybody he invited had to show up. You did not show up for an invitation for Nero. Otherwise, you may end up the next one killed. And at the garden parties, he would take posts and put them up and tie Christians to the posts and dip the Christians in tar while they were alive and then set fire to them so they would be the lights of the party and burn through the evening. That happened right there. The reason I say this is it was so bad. I'm trying to remember if it was Suetonius or Cassius. One of these guys, one of the historians, Roman historians, were talking about how bad this was. This historian from Rome said the Christians probably should be killed, but this is so repulsive what Nero is doing. Even those of us who want the Christians killed don't want this. Nero was an absolute monster from 60 to 68 AD. Now, here's why I bring this up. When Paul said, obey those who have the rule over you, he did it in probably the best government the world had ever seen up to that point in time. Now, I hear people today talk about things like, if you live in North Korea or China, and I've heard other examples like this, you still have to follow the government because, after all, God put them in authority over you. And there's also a corresponding verse in Peter which has the same issues. The point being is, if you look in Romans 13, we're not going to do it now, but if you were dig into that at home, you know what you're going to find? You're going to find Paul talking about how the government is there for your good to take care of you, and if you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone and they'll treat you right. Does that sound like Nero of 60 AD onward? So the point being is the historical context changes the entire meaning. In light of that, I actually think John MacArthur is doing what he should be doing. And I agree with what he's doing out there, because this is something where when you say that non-Christians can meet in large groups but Christians can't get together, that's a problem, not only constitutionally but religiously. But anytime you hear this verse come up, don't think in terms of, wait a second, are we obeying or not? Think of it in terms of the historical context. And again, that's how we sort this out. Now I want to go to, change the photo also, I want to go to 1 John chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 3 and 4. I want you to think back first to that photo that I put up in the beginning. Anybody remember it? Does anybody remember if it was night or day? Nighttime, okay. Anybody, you probably guessed what time it was taken, like midnight or something like that maybe? Nope. I think it was about 11:30. Yeah, okay. I think it was about 11:30 in the morning if I remember correctly. What does that tell you? You just learned some context here, geographical and context. What does that tell you about this store? Arctic Circle, I heard the word. Actually, it's more than 350 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Linda and I were there in a town named Barrow. It's a wonderful place to be. And the thing I was going to say is, the reason it's this way is it was winter. It was about a week before Christmas. Without the context, you would assume that this store was taking at night. Thanks. That's what I was going to get back to. Now, the reason I put this here is, this is one of the most ridiculous stop signs on the planet. It really is. And I had to take a picture of it because just beyond the stop sign, there's a little dirt path there. You know, you got a car, every 30 minutes might go by there or something. It's a little village. They got this stop sign, and beyond that is everything out beyond that that's white is the Arctic Ocean. The point being is, it looks ridiculous until you know the context. The context is showing, hey, this thing here is totally different in a place like Barrow, and that's the Arctic Ocean. You wouldn't know that otherwise. The point is, back here again, what I'm trying to bring up is, by learning these things about context, we learn more about what's happening in other areas. Let me go to 1 John 2, 3, and 4. Dive right into that. If we look at that, it says, by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. The one who says, I have come to know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. If I say the truth is not in you or the truth is not in me, that's saying the person's not saved. Think about it. Jesus Christ has the truth himself, but also that truth is in us if we're indwelt by the Holy Spirit. And he's saying that if we have the truth in us, we keep his commandments. Okay, everybody in here who has followed every commandment in the Bible since you've been saved, please put your hand up. I got to get mine down. We got a problem here, don't we? Because we look at these two verses, what these two verses are saying, nobody's saved. That obviously isn't what John meant when he wrote this. This is a case where we need to look at the context of the book or the letter entirely, okay? When John wrote 1 John, he was writing to a problem church. And in that church, a breakaway group had come out and set up another church. And when they did that, they were using the name of Christ, but they weren't acting like it. These were people that were characterized by their backbiting and by their immorality and everything else, whereas the true church that was left in that town was characterized by their love. The point being is that if you don't know that, you're going to say, why is John saying this? Well, you know what you find in 1 John quite a bit? 1 John is using hyperbole. He's saying things that are extreme to make us realize, and what he's trying to tell the people is, if you're saved, you're going to follow the commandments of Christ. That is a true statement. But it's not saying you're going to follow every single one of them like you'd get if you just read these verses by themselves. Matter of fact, if we go to verse 19 in this, verse 19 says, verse 19 says, they went from us, but they were not really of us. For if they had been of us, they would have remained with us, but they went out so that it would be shown that they were not all of us. Well, that's a hard one to read. The point being is this context, what we're seeing here is, John is speaking in black and white terms to get the message across. When he talks about, I mentioned earlier about God is love. I'm probably going to shock you. There's only 2 spots in the entire Bible that phrase occurs. God is a loving God. We know that from other places. But God is love is twice, both in 1 John chapter 4. And both times using hyperbole. Boy, that's a whole other message to get into that, so we're going to drop that one. But the point being is that while God is a loving God, you know what is found over 350 times in the Bible? God is holy. You know what the problem is? If God is love, then he can't judge sin. Then he can't have wrath. Then he can't have any of the other things that it takes to make him not to make him, but to be who he is. God is holy above all else. And if we don't know the context of 1 John, we miss what it means to be saved, and we also miss what it is about God himself, about being holy, and what God is love means. I want to turn to Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. And I have this up here because this is a restaurant it reminds me of. Every time I read 3:20. It's actually I was going to tell you this is one of the best restaurants in the world if you ever visit Prague, called Maria Relke. Unfortunately, I found out it closed about a year ago, so if you go to Prague, you're on your own. Very reasonable price. It was Linda and I used to love to go there. Went there a couple times, couple trips to Prague every time, and I go there each night. But the thing I was going to say is if you read Revelation 3:20, it says, 19 to 20, it says, those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. Therefore be zealous and to repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him and he with me. How many times you heard that to tell people about how to get saved? That's how we use it, isn't it? Many times. Because Christ is going to come in and eat with you and dine with you, and we use that as a salvation verse over and over and over again. The context of that verse is talking specifically about the church in Laodicea, a church that is neither hot nor cold, that God wants to vomit out of his mouth because he's so disgusted with them. He's not talking to non-believers. He's saying, if you're in this church and you're willing to get hot, I'll be there for you. Come on into the restaurant. We'll dine and we'll have a great time. He's talking exclusively to believers. Now, am I saying we shouldn't tell non-believers about meeting Christ? Certainly not. But that's not what this one verse means here. Many, many years ago, I probably shouldn't admit how many, but actually over 40 years ago now, I worked with Child Evangelism Fellowship in this area. And if you know anything about Child Evangelism Fellowship, good group, I'm not knocking them, but you've got, G-O-S-P-E-L, you sing it, you got G is God is love, O is only begotten Son, on through the whole thing, okay? And each one of those points has a verse with it, and one of those points for, let him in was the L. Let him in, Revelation 3:20. And me and another guy actually talked to one of the people in CEF about this and said, that verse doesn't mean that. Don't you realize that? And you know what the response was? I mean, good guy, but you know what his response was? I know it doesn't really mean that, but the verse is so good. No, it's not good if it doesn't mean that. The Bible is truth. The Bible is God's Word. There are other verses we can use for that. But this verse here that you're going to see over and over again, that verse doesn't mean that. That verse never meant that. Now, since I've actually got the time here, I'm going to actually do a few more verses. I'm paying attention. I will be done in 35 minutes. Matthew 18, 15 through 17 talks about church discipline. We've all heard this one. If a brother offends you, I can say if a brother offends you, pluck it out, but that's really mixing up two verses. If a brother offends you, go talk to him. If it doesn't work, take elders with you. If it doesn't work, take him before the church. That's the way it's translated. There's one problem with this. This was several years before the church existed. So how is Christ right, or how is Matthew right? And he's writing backwards, but when Christ spoke this, the church didn't exist. And what you find if you study these verses is it's talking about the Jewish elders, either the local elders or possibly even the Sanhedrin. Now, I still think it's a good set of verses to use for church discipline because it's good advice. Nothing wrong with that. Go by yourself, then take a friend, then take the elders with you. But not because it's written to the church. We get that mixed up all the time. Matter of fact, if you look at the Gospels, there is actually only one time in all four Gospels that the word ecclesia is used to refer to the church. And that is when Christ in Matthew 16, when he's talking about a future event. There's not one mention of the church in the Gospels. The reason? Because until Christ was crucified, he was there for the Jews, going to the Jews to offer them the kingdom. It was only after his death that he said, they said, now go to everyone. If you go to Jeremiah 29:11, you knew this one was going to be here, didn't you? For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Years ago, I taught this in one of the churches I was at, and afterwards, half joking, half serious, a woman who was a dear friend came up and said, "You destroyed the verse that I use all the time." There are other verses. But when God said, when Jeremiah said, I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, not for calamity, to give you hope and a future and a hope, he was writing specifically to exiled Jews who were going to go back from Babylon, who were going to go back into Israel in the future. It was probably in many cases going to be, the exile was 70 years, probably 50 to 70 years before this happened. By the time this verse came true, most of them would be dead. God did have a plan for them. But we can't lift a verse where God has a plan for someone else and automatically say, now it applies to us. Because it doesn't. And again, the problem is not, you know something? I do believe that God has a plan for every single believer in here, and there's verses I could point to show you that. But the point is if we start mixing up the verses now and start misusing the verses, they end up building on one another. And I've seen so many times when you've got these doctrines that don't make any sense because they've been built on false assumption after false assumption after false assumption. One more that I want to look at, and I had this told to me. 1 Chronicles 16:22. Do not touch my anointed ones. Many times, well, not many times, several times I've had said to me directly, one by a pastor in particular, who said, you may not touch the Lord's anointed. Meaning, you can't go against the pastor. Well, there's a couple problems with this. Number one, if you finish the verse that said, do my prophets no harm. He's talking about the prophets for being the anointed ones. He wasn't talking about the New Testament. He wasn't talking about pastors. Pastors weren't going to exist for another 1,000 years or whatever it was. When you hear someone say, do not touch the Lord's anointed, normally they're trying to start up a cult. Because that is absolutely to try to get you to not question them. And in the one case where I had that said to me in particular, I happened to be the one to discover that it was in a large church that I was part of, and that every last degree, every last thing the pastor said, and everything about his entire life was a complete fraud and fabrication, including his doctorates, his PhDs, everything you can think of. And yet he was going around telling me and others, do not touch the Lord's anointed. Good pastors aren't worried about verses like that because you don't need a verse like that, but a pastor is not anointed in the way a prophet is. Pastors are called, but they're not anointed. It's a different thing, and that verse simply doesn't apply. I said all this stuff now, and you know something you might be thinking, I'm hoping you're thinking, okay, what do we do with this? He just threw a whole pile of stuff at me, and I don't know what to do with it. Well, I brought my friend along to tell you about it. This is a little buddy that I met about 1.5 years ago out in Bryce Canyon when I was hiking through there. And believe it or not, he was about 2 feet away from me, and he sat there and he posed, and we talked to each other for a little while. And the question you should be asking yourself right now is, now what? What's all this mean? This is where we have to find out how to apply this. And what we need study and learning with action, with life change. Either one by themselves doesn't do anything. We've got to put the two together. We have to learn the real meanings of the verses. We have to learn the context. But then once we've done that, we've got to apply it to our lives. Many years ago, my mom made a pound cake for me. Well, not just for me, but for several people. And she was actually trying to be very nice. And she took the pound cake, and she brought it out, and it was a fresh pound cake made from scratch. And she cut the first piece and said, here, this is for you. And I took a bite of it. And I couldn't talk anymore for about 30 seconds or so. Because without realizing it, my mom had taken, instead of powdered sugar to put over the top and coat it with, she had coated it with cornstarch. Yeah, I know. I didn't know this, but you know something? If you lose all the saliva in your mouth, you can't speak. I was sitting there trying to speak, couldn't say a word. Took a good 20, 30 seconds before I could talk. My point is, when you bake a cake, even if it's just the last thing, you've got to follow the recipe. I don't care what you do. I love to do candied pork loins and other things like that I make at home. I have my own recipe, but the point is I've got to follow it. If I skip a step, something's going to be wrong. If you put cornstarch on top of a cake, you're going to have a problem. I guarantee it. The point being is the recipe, the learning, that's what we're talking about here with the study. That's what we're talking about, keeping verses in context. It's the kind of thing that we need to know and need to be able to actually go through and figure out what is God saying. You know, think of it this way. Each one of us that's a believer says the most important thing in our life is our relationship with God, and it is. But how often do we put, whether it's football or fishing or what, I'm not against any of these things, but whatever in our life, and say, and our actions say, no, these are more important than my relationship to God is. If we don't put God in it first, we got a problem. But you know what putting God first is? To read His instructions to us. He didn't write the Bible just for His own amusement. He wrote it so that we could understand what He wanted, so that we could understand His character. That's what the Bible's about. Now, the other problem with that, you ever meet somebody who studies recipes, reads recipes all day, knows everything about cooking, can tell you what temperature to set it to and everything else, and they never went into the kitchen and actually cooked something? Yeah. It can be anything. I mean, I own a computer networking company as well. That's what I do for a living. And I was going to say that I've known guys that know all the theory behind computer networking. They're useless in the field. You couldn't send them out if you had to. We've got to know both. Learning the verses in context, that'll give us our foundation. That'll give us our base. Letting those verses change our lives. That's going to change our relationship. That's going to change how we see God. That's how we're going to change how we see other people. Everything about it, it's funny too, everything about our life should be changed. I hear people talk about the secular world and the spiritual world. For a Christian, I don't go with that. I understand what they mean. Everything is spiritual for a Christian. I don't care what you're doing. Because anything you do, you know what the ultimate goal is to glorify God. And everything we do, whether it's our work, whether it's being in church, whether it's our relationship with God, whatever it is, should all be to glorify God. And you know, not only because God deserves the glory, but one other reason. If we were to go, we don't now, but if we went through Ephesians 1, you know what we find? The Gentiles were told to act abnormal for them. Don't act like normal Gentiles. Why? Because other people will see how you act and realize, you know something, these people have been changed. That's how we draw people to Christ. By changed life and the gospel. The other thing I was going to say that we have to be careful with, one of the reasons I'm so big on context is this. It's very easy to fall for people with bad context and fall for, we've got things going around now. You look at most churches nowadays, prosperity gospel for a lot of them. That's not the gospel. Social gospel. That's not the gospel. You've got guys that are sitting on television talking about why each one needs a $60 million airplane. And it's not just a $60 million airplane. If you've actually seen the discussions, they're disgusting. The point that I'm trying to make is we can fall for those things if we don't understand the Bible and we don't read the Bible. And there's something else I want to make clear here. Some people think the Bible is good because for people like me because I've got the degrees and I've studied it all before the degrees I was studying the Bible on my own. But the point is, you know something? No, I don't care who you are in this room. The Bible is just as much for you as it is for me. There's nobody in Christianity that is exempt from studying God's Word to get to know who God is. That's how we build a relationship. If you're married in here, you know what I mean. What would you think if you had a relationship and you never learned anything about what your wife liked or your husband liked or anything else? Oh, we'll just throw out random things and hope that they like it. It's not going to be a good situation. We do the same thing with God, and we expect that just because we have a good attitude, everything's going to be cool. You need the attitude, but you also need to learn what the Bible, we all need to learn what the Bible says and keep it in context. Let's go ahead and pray.